Okay, thanks for having me. It won't be much of a lecture, really. I'll just speak for a very short time. And most of the time we'll have together, I think, will be just talking, and I'll answer questions you have. And so I won't speak for too long. I suppose I was asked if I would speak to you about nonviolence because many of you know, many of you have been students of mine, and some of my best students, that I am a pacifist, so it's not merely a theoretical position for me, but a position that I actually hold. I have deep convictions about it, so that is why I am here, I suppose. So, first of all, I want to say that it seems clear to me, and I hope also to you, that as we human beings think about the human condition and human experience and human history, we quite obviously and understandably see it as a unfolding of conflict. And whatever ideology you adhere to, however conservative or progressive you are, whether you're a Marxist or a Burkean, you know, it's easy to see human history as a history of conflict. And there are winners and there are losers. And there are a lot of dead bodies. And the hope of most people is that the right bodies are the dead ones. And that the people with right or truth or justice on their side are the ones who remain standing. And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. But history is a history of violence. And I think that very common perception is fundamentally wrong. Whereas history is obviously filled with violence, it's filled with much more nonviolence. Human beings are in conflict often, and almost always find a way to resolve their conflict nonviolently. So to presuppose that nonviolence simply can't work is, it seems to me, an empirically dubious claim. Now, if only we were trained differently, you know, by our public schools, by our cultures, by our societies, by our traditions, by our books, and so on, I think we could probably look at human history and see it as the unfolding of nonviolence, at least as easily as we see it as the unfolding of violence. And I'll just mention two texts, maybe three texts to you that are of some help in so doing. One is a book written by Jonathan Schell, entitled, and I think some of you have read this, The Unconquerable World. Another is a book written by Duval and Ackerman entitled The Force More Powerful. And the third text is written by John Howard Yoder. It's entitled Nonviolence, A Brief History, The Warsaw Lectures, because unsurprisingly they were a set of lectures he gave in Warsaw. Those three texts, and I'll leave it at those, if you were interested, would give you a glimpse of what I've just said, the claim I've just made, that there is an alternative way to understand human history, and that it's not so much guided by, directed by violence, but as it is nonviolence. Now, nonviolent convictions and practices and theories have both philosophical foundations and spiritual or theological foundations. There are of two kinds. And for a decent text that argues for nonviolence from a philosophical perspective, a perspective that invokes no spirituality, no faith, no religious tradition, no theology, I would recommend a book by Robert Holmes entitled The Problem of War. When it comes to theories, practices, traditions, and communities of nonviolence of the faith or theological variety, there are many. John Howard Yoder, for example, has written a fine book entitled Nevertheless, in which he identifies 19 different kinds of Christian pacifism. So nonviolence is a fact of human existence that has a rich, diverse, sometimes contentious, and interesting history all its own. Now, as to philosophical or non-faith arguments for nonviolence, they usually amount to some form of, if we give it a chance, it'll work. And it's self-evidently a very bad thing to kill people unless you have to do so. And it turns out we really don't have to. So let's not do it. Traditions and communities of nonviolence that are faith-based, by faith-based I mean, of course, religious, spiritual, or theologically based, sometimes make that argument too, but that, of course, is not their entire argument. They're persons who represent faith-based perspectives, of course, think there's some metaphysical truth in the universe, some ultimate moral authority that, in fact, would have us not kill one another. And so there's a kind of obedience, a kind of discipleship, a kind of getting it that may imbue oneself. And so perhaps quite apart from efficacy, perhaps quite apart from whether nonviolence works or not, we should be nonviolent nonetheless. By violence, by the way, I mean lethal violence purposefully directed towards other human beings. Now, I can't speak authoritatively about all kinds of nonviolence from all kinds of religious traditions. That's just something I'm not up to. But I can say a little bit about certain kinds of Christian pacifism, and so I'll say a little bit about that, perhaps. Gandhi said, as many of you know, that when violence does something good, and of course it does on occasion, and perhaps often enough, whatever that means, does do something good, the good is both temporary and it brings with it consequences which are not good. And so the employ of violence is, to say the very least, for every step forward you take at least a step back. There's no way to use violence in some kind of pure, clean, unproblematic, surgical, beautiful way. And Gandhi said, on the other hand, when people act non-violently, yet with courage and non-violently in a certain way, even in the moment, although it may look ineffective or problematic or that it warrants further destruction and harm and so on, in fact, in the long run, it does much more good. And so there's a cumulative effect over history whereby nonviolence is effective. Even if in the moment it doesn't appear to be so. And violence is regressive, non-efficacious, even if in the moment it looks to be working quite well. Thank you. Right? And it's not hard to imagine everyone in this room has complete clarity about the fact that on occasions, in certain instances, violence solves a problem. You know, it just does. And it looks like the way to solve that problem, and the only way to solve the problem, and we're damn glad that problem got solved. You know, this is obvious. But for people who agree with Gandhi, there's something illusory about that. It's not the way the universe is put together in the long run. John Howard Yoder, to use him again, says that to practice violence is to go against the grain of the universe. You know, and you can do that, but in the long run, nonviolence, peace, justice in its fullness, brought about nonviolently, that's where we're going. That's where the universe is going. And so it just makes more sense to get with the grain of the universe sooner rather than later, right? And so Gandhi, Yoder, people like this, both of the secular and the non-secular variety, have this kind of view. Now, as I said when I began my remarks, it's a commonplace, and it's an understandable commonplace, to see human history as a history of conflict and violence. And to abstract from that observation the idea that nonviolence just doesn't work. It might work on occasion here or there, but in hard cases, when you have to stop a totalitarian, brutal regime, a murderous clan, you know, a military leader, a murderous force, under some circumstances, nonviolence simply does not work. Whereas for all of its problems, violence does. That's the ordinary human view held by nearly all people. And it has the virtue of being simple. And it has the virtue of being the appearance of it has the appearance of self-evidence, almost, you know. But in fact, nonviolence often does work. For example, if you read Duvall and Ackerman, as I mentioned moments ago, you'll find many cases where it's worked. If you read Shell, you'll find many cases where it's worked. And so I don't only mean, if you took me to mean earlier, that I was talking about nonviolence works in interpersonal relationships and, you know, in Canada, the United States have a trade disagreement and so on. If that's what you took me to mean, I mean something far more demanding than that. I mean to say that in the most demanding, most gruesome, most difficult, most bloody kinds of circumstances, nonviolence has a history of working. And you have text I've already given you if you want to look at examples and so on. And I'll say, I guess, two things. One is I'll make a very brief comment about a Christian nonviolence, which is the kind of nonviolence I know best, and then a comment about democracy and nonviolence. And then I'll answer questions, and we can just talk. Whereas, of course, there are non-faith-based theories, versions, and practices and communities of nonviolence, I don't think they're robust, and I don't think they're very efficacious, and I'm pessimistic about their power to change the world. And I don't understand them deeply, and I don't think even their advocates have a lot of faith when it comes right down to it in their own words, just to be blunt. On the other hand, there are many thousands of people who, out of the very fiber of their being, out of the very depth of their innermost self, have the deepest conviction about the absolute moral truth and purpose and necessity of nonviolence, who are quite willing to lose their lives in its practice. So there are people who are quite willing to say that people should be willing to die for a number of things. But being willing to die is much different than being willing to make others die. And the central Christian claim is that there is a God who entered human history nonviolently, created a community, set about to create a community. It's being created. It's not like it's happened yet, which is nonviolent. And nonviolent here means radically graceful, loving, compassionate, sacrificial, and so on. And that agency of power as a manifestation of the love, which is in fact the warp and woof of the universe, is simply more powerful. It sounds like a bad pop song or something, I know, but is simply more powerful than fear. It's simply more powerful in the end than anything and all things arrayed against it. And that if God, in fact, entered human history and meant to change everything about the human condition radically, then it follows that our allegiance to violence is one of those things that must be changed. Because if, for example, you could still break out the violence when you thought it was necessary, then in fact, there's no radical change. Then in fact, there is no good news. There's nothing new, and there's nothing good. We're just stuck with the same old life we've always had. And of course, the Christian claim is that that's not the case. Now, the last thing I'll say is, I think it's important to see, let me say, I was really, I don't know what the word is. Heartened would sound condescending, so I don't mean heartened, but I enjoyed listening to your meeting before I, came up here, because it was filled with all kinds of, we got to fight this war against education. We've got to unionize labor, and on, And so what I mean by nonviolence is that. right? Nonviolence isn't the absence of struggle and the absence of conflict and the absence of risk and the absence of sacrifice. You know, nonviolence is the complete, full, head-on, absolute, you know, pedal to the metal, relentless fight for everything good. And I think it's important to see nonviolence not as the absence of lethal violence, but as this positive, aggressive, profound, courageous, vigorous, relentless fight for everything good. And in this way, when things get better, when justice is done, when workers have rights, and so on, when health care becomes more available, and on and on and on, nonviolence is being done. And it's displacing violence because without those positive steps that take place nonviolently, you would, sooner or later, indeed have violence. And so, for example, democratization, as I understand it, is simply nonviolence in slow motion. So I think if we understand nonviolence deeply rather than as some kind of caricature, and we understand history deeply rather than as some kind of cliche, I think we are in a position to see something about the power of nonviolence, even apart from faith-based claims. I think I'll stop there and leave it at that, and then, you know, we can talk and I'll answer questions. Would it be valuable to put the chairs in a big circle? Is that what you guys like to do? Okay.
Understood as a very specialized sense, which is coupled with the claim that all successive violence is temporary and necessarily brings with these ills, is incredibly ahistorical. And I think that, how would you respond to someone who says, no, the actual position to have is both nonviolence and violence needs to be understood in their precise historical context. And in many cases, violence brings great goods, but also in many cases it brings bad goods, or great harms. But also, in plenty of cases, nonviolence brings, again, great goods, but also in many places it brings great harm. And that the way to actually determine this is not to have some teleological view of history, but to concretely analyze the actual history of actions taken by actors in specific times, and see exactly what is or what they caused and how they actually worked out.
Okay. Well, I think that if you don't have a teleological view of history, then it would be very hard to be a pacifist. I think that if your analysis in life is, as you've described it, material, empirical in the most, sort of narrow sense, and you simply count up deficits and costs and values added, and who's left standing and who do you get to bury and what are the material conditions after this event happened and so on. If that's the kind of analysis you make, and it's entirely absent of transcendent convictions or convictions about a non-empirical reality and so on, then I think people who see themselves as pacifists and pacifists on this basis alone, let's call it the material basis alone, I think have made it very hard for themselves. And I was trying to say that earlier in a shorter fashion. But I mean, it's just clear, and I also tried to make this. I thought I had pretty much said this, but I mean, quite obviously, any number of occasions of violence have brought about goods. That's just a fact. There's no reason to deny that. No thinking individual could deny that. Sometimes we're better off that some people are dead. And that's just the way it is. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But of course, I've got to remember some people think they'd be better off if I were dead. And, maybe they have a point to make too. And so I think it's a dangerous world in which we realize, well, things would be better if these, certain others were dead, because we all can make pretty strong arguments for who we should kill. And, I don't know who would be left standing. So I'm not denying, and I thought I said clearly that violence sometimes brings about very obvious, very clear goods. I didn't mean to communicate that never happens. And I also think that nonviolence of a certain kind, some kinds of nonviolence, bring about is unjustified, it's unwarranted, it's not to be condoned, and it's dangerous and destructive. Gandhi said, for example, better to be a soldier and shoot at people than be a coward. And I agree with him in that respect. So I actually agree with you quite deeply. And so I think without a transcendent teleological view, it makes pacifism, in my view, hard to adhere to. Josh?
I just kind of wanted to clear up, maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but the view that the grain of history is towards nonviolence. Is that an empirical claim? Because it seems like the 20th century was the bloodiest century that's ever occurred. Do you mean something different than we're becoming more violent, less violent as a society? What did you mean by that exactly?
Okay. Well, I quoted Yoder, who said the grain of the universe is, we're going against the grain of the universe when we act nonviolently, because he in fact has a transcendent, metaphysical, religious, teleological view.
Going against the grain of the universe when we act violently.
Pardon me?
Going against the grain of the universe when we act violently.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say. I didn't say that. So, I think in material, empirical terms about history, this is happening, right? I think in some respects, human beings are at least as violent as they've ever been, and perhaps more violent in some ways. But then I think we're probably better about some things too, perhaps. And I don't think you can judge the moment of history you're in very accurately. And so we just don't know. We just don't know. None of us know. And of course none of us know, that's a truism. Let me say it more carefully. None of us have very decent predictive powers about what the world's going to be like, say 100 years from now, in this respect. There's certain things we can predict pretty accurately, but not this. To say 100 years from now, human beings are going to be more peaceable or less peaceable, we don't know. Now, I do a field of studies, peace studies, in which a lot of social scientists, a lot of people who keep data and quantify that data and use it in comparative fashion, looking at different kinds of violence over the decades, and they look at patterns and so on. A lot of those people, if they were sitting here, I'm talking about sociologists and political scientists and so on, with a certain skill set, they would say we are actually becoming less violent. And there's a lot of data you could muster for that argument. I'm aware of that data, and I know the argument. I'm just not making it to you because I'm quite willing to say, and I'm not sure that's true. I don't think we can judge the people in any moment of history are not the people to judge that moment of history. And, I think there are very promising indicators about certain aspects of our behavior, but there are very troubling indicators too. And I think it's all fragile. I think every good thing we're doing is fragile, and it could implode easily. But at the same time, history is sort of a burst of surprises, and things happen when we least expect it to happen for the good as well. So I don't know. Yes.
So, would you include self-defense? Because it seems to me like nobody wants to be violent. You know what I mean? Just not because it's even for a moral reason, just because it's you could get hurt. You know what I mean? And that sucks. So it seems to me like the reality is, if you look at any history, like whenever there's been any real social change, it's always been people that have been forced, generally from self-defense, to fight back. Even the offense is a form of defense. And I wanted to point out, like for example, when the North was fighting the South in the Civil War, that was one of the bloodiest war. I think if you do it on the basis of how many people actually were in the United States or in the world at the time, in history at the time,
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wanted to say, it seems to me like the reality is that we create these cancers, or maybe like with increasing production, we are able to generate the kind of surpluses and the things that we have that enable like new social systems to arise, but also new cancers to arise, and somehow you have to have like enough radiation or something to go and kill the cancer. So I don't know. It seems to me like there's no way to really avoid it. It's kind of like a self-defense mechanism. If my boss, I don't know, like we have a strike and the National Guard is sent out, like what are you going to do? Like you could just give in, maybe you have to give in, but if you're able to stop it, even if it means the way it did in the 30s, like what are you going to do about it,
Okay. Well, you've made out of the many things you said, I'm going to take three. You made three claims I want to address, okay? One is that you implied that a person has a moral, it's morally legitimate to defend yourself if you need to do so violently. Well, if that's true, I don't see why it's not true, equally true, that I have a moral, if it's morally justified for me to defend myself, then I think I have the same moral right if you're in the same circumstances. And in fact, if I have a moral obligation to defend myself, I believe I also have a moral obligation to defend another person who's in the same circumstance, right? So I don't think that self-defense trumps the defense of others. And I do, in fact, believe we have a moral obligation to defend ourselves. I never said otherwise. I just believe that our defense of ourselves should not extend to the killing of others. There are other ways to defend oneself and others. Okay, and we haven't talked about that, but that's another thing. You also said that there's a kind of, it's necessary, it's inevitable, it's natural. If I'm pushed in a corner, if I'm pushed down, if I get kicked one more time, if I suffer just enough, if I see my child go through that again, there's just some circumstances where I have a natural, physiological, genetic, biological, evolutionary, my adrenaline pumps, we all know this, we've had enough psychology and sociology and anthropology and everything else to know that we have a very natural inclination to fight. You said, and therefore, you said, that you applied so therefore isn't that a basis to in fact do so under certain conditions? And my answer to that is no. I understand the natural inclination, I get it. But I think we have a lot of natural inclinations to do a lot of things. And that doesn't mean you should do it. And everyone here can think of such instances, Everyone, unless, you're not real healthy, you have a healthy libido, right? And you see a number of people that you think that would kind of be interesting to have sex with that person, what would that be like? I don't think that's a warrant for doing it.
But under these certain conditions, it should.
I agree with that. A third claim you made is that history shows us, you said, history shows us that every social advance we've made towards justice and towards better societies, and it's just come about through violence. And that's the very reading of history that I begin my remarks contending. I just flatly, strongly disagree with that supposition. I do not think history teaches us that at all. Far from it. So those are 3 remarks to 3 claims.
Just to make a quick comment, because when you think about that situation where you feel like you need to defend yourself, and then again, if there's another innocent person who's being threatened just like you feel the need to defend them. My sense is that sometimes when you decide to use violence, rather than the result of that being that you defend another innocent person, let alone yourself, at times you're even bringing violence down upon that other innocent person. Because it seems like in situations like, say, for example, the struggle of Palestinians against Israeli occupation, there are a lot of ways you could go against resisting the occupation. And because some of the factions have many times used a lot of violence in resisting the occupation, which I feel is justified, based on what the Israelis do, I think it's certainly justified to use violence to resist that. But the practical effect of that oftentimes is that those other people that you say that you are you're fighting on their behalf or trying to protect by using violence, the practical result is that really bad things happen to them oftentimes because of what the Israelis do in response to the violence that you unleash. So when just the idea of say shooting rockets at towns in southern Israel, even if that's justified, what type of an effect does that have on other people in Gaza when the entire Gaza Strip gets bombed and schools and hospitals and all these things and big apartment buildings get flattened? So that doesn't necessarily mean that you should never use violence, but if you are going to use violence, you have to be really, really thoughtful about what is the effect going to be, not just for me, because obviously it would suck if I die as a result of fighting, but what is the result going to be on all these other people that my actions are going to indirectly affect and the misery I'm going to cause to them? Do they feel like are they supportive of what I'm doing by using violence, or are they not supportive of it? So you have to take the situation of other people around you into account.
True enough. Greg wants to respond.
Yeah, if I can respond a little bit. I think there's 3 main points that need to be made. And I think that the Palestinian situation is a really good indicator that can be generalized to most of our society, especially under capitalism, which is, yes, it's very easy to say, look at the Palestinians, look what they brought down on themselves. Again, and you don't even have to say they were unjustified in shooting rockets at Israel, or anything they do. At this point, not everything, but the list of things that the Palestinians, it's completely justified or very justified for the Palestinians to do, is huge given the ongoing genocide. So you don't even have to make that claim, but you make this claim, which is, well, look what sort of harm they're pulling down on themselves and their compatriots by their actions. But I think that's a very ideological view, and the reason that it's a very ideological view is because we always have to ask the question, what is the zero sum of no violent resistance being used, right? They have tried the civil rights route. They have tried the pacifist route. Various groups have constantly tried doing this, and one of the big reasons they did, admittedly, was because their initial armed offensive failed. So they tried it a different way. That's failed. Now they're trying it all sorts of different ways. But the zero level of the Palestinian situation is not peace between the Israelis and the Palestinian. It's constant encroachment and murder of the Palestinians at a slower rate, but at just as sure a rate as the bombings and the occupation and the tanks. And so with this example, I would like to, again, generalize it. I'm not saying it's a universal example for all times in history, but I do think it's a very good example for our current point in history, which is such that to not engage in revolutionary violence as I see it is to exist in this system at a zero-sum level, which means that the Indian Maoists who are being murdered, not Indian Maoists, they didn't start as Maoists, the Indian tribes that are being murdered for bauxite would continue to be murdered for bauxite, just at perhaps a slower rate, but still as short. Same thing with Papua New Guinea. Same thing with the Middle East. Same thing with Latin America and the death squads. And so it's vitally important that we I think, in a systemic ideological view, to see violence as systemically inherent, not essential, not human nature, not destiny, not fate, but a systemic feature of our day-to-day existence. And quite often, especially for first world people, that systemic violence is obscured through distance. But just real quick, the second thing is, I think you're absolutely right. I think that in any sort of maxim of violence, we should look to Che Guevara. Che Guevara said, all moral violence is successful violence, which is not transitive. If you do not believe in any legitimate way that your violence will occur, you don't even really have a particularly honest hope that your violence is going to be successful, that your violence is going to cause change. And you can dress it up in all the Marxist or religious or national liberation. If you don't honestly think your violence is going to be successful, if you do it, you are absolutely immoral in doing it. And so in that case, I would definitely agree with you. And I'll just leave the third point because I've gone long enough.
If I might just very briefly, I think Greg just said something, two things really important that are really important, and it might be one in a positive sense and one in a negative sense. That is, I want to strongly agree with one thing and strongly disagree with another. That is, I think it's really important to understand violence not simply as bullets coming out of the end of a gun and knives or bayonets being plunged into bodies and bombs being dropped. Capitalism is a form of violence, in my view. It just is. Law, as laws exist in many societies, or many laws in many societies, is a form of violence. There are a lot of ways to name violence, and it is systemic, it is structural, and it is deep. And if we only think of violence as bombs dropping and shots being fired, then we've got a problem right from the get-go. We're not going to be able to analyze it correctly, and we're not going to be able to engage it, and we're not going to be able to defeat it. But, and by the way, I think, and this is probably ironic or paradoxical for you, Greg, but I think the more one understands just that, the more one understands how one can combat and overcome violence nonviolently. But you said, and here's of course where I disagree, that we know, you have spoken with a kind of certainty about how we know violence did this, and this. It was good and good and good and good. And if people would not have acted violently, if people would have acted non-violently, it would have been bad, it would have been bad, it would have been... You speak with confidence about the good done by violence and the harm that would have been done by nonviolence, or that is done by nonviolence. And I don't think we can, any of us, speak that confidently, because we're speaking about what we literally cannot know. We're speaking about hypotheticals. History, Michael Oshot that says that historians often use history as a mannequin, not a mannequin, but what are these things? A
Okay.
dummy. Like the way a ventriloquist uses a dummy. We make it say what we want it to say. And historians aren't the only people who do that. We all fall into that far too easily, far too often. We just don't know. We just don't know what would have happened if, then and there, in this case or that, if something different would have been done. We just don't know. And so, I'm quite willing to say, yes, on occasion, in circumstances, we see violence do certain good things. It's immediate, it's clear, but I'm not willing to make these large, certain claims about what violence always does or about what nonviolence always does, because in fact, if something happens in a historical episode X, then all the non-X's that might have happened did not happen. And we cannot say what all of those non-X's would have brought about. We just can't do that.
Well, then I would say this, that argument cuts both ways. And because it cuts both ways, every time you say, well, look what nonviolence brought, then it cuts both ways. The easy response is yes, but if they would have engaged in revolutionary violence, it certainly would have been better. Or at least you can't know, right, the negative claim. You can't know that revolutionary violence would have been better, because if you're going to make an argument, which, fine, counterfactuals are always difficult, I'm more than willing to concede that, but to ground that as a position, which is fine, but again, it's a position that cuts both ways. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about all violence in all times, acts in all ways. I would say it's specific forms of violence that have to have specific forms of conditions. Just as I was saying earlier, the underground, and they did their best to avoid lethal violence. But them blowing up buildings, whether anyone was hurt or not, is morally irresponsible. And it's morally irresponsible because they had no idea how it would actually lead to anything.
Yeah. No, I think you and I are close in a lot of ways, and I do know it cuts both ways. It's just that maybe I don't sound like it, but I maybe arrogantly, but I think I have a more humility about my views than you have about yours. Just maybe I'm wrong, but I do know it cuts both ways, and I tried to make that clear. But I'm just willing to say, and I have a theological view and you don't, and that's the big difference between us, right? Is I just think something is true about where what the universe is like and where it's going that you don't think we could know. Even if it were true, we wouldn't know it, and that's the fundamental difference we have, of course.
Yeah, I was get off that topic. I was curious what you meant when you said that you view capitalism as a form of violence. I'm curious what you think about that.
Okay. Well, I think I'm going to be very brief about this, very simple about it, but I suspect many of you have to do a lot of reading, a lot of research, and a lot of thinking about this, and to be very articulate about it in your own ways. But I think that capitalism is an order of exchange based upon fundamental premises which are intrinsically immoral. The profit motive. The idea that people earn what they deserve what they earn, and that the market, for all of its flaws, is the most fair order of exchange we can create, and that labor needs to be kept as cheap, and I'll just stop there. But those are premises that I believe are all intrinsic to capitalism. That they are a necessary part of what capitalism is. And I believe that all those claims I just made are violent, that the results of them, the manifestation of them are violent. It allows people to justify gross inequality, for example. And that's a moral affront to me. Gross inequality is a moral affront to me. And I think that any human suffering that is avoidable and non-trite. I don't mean, you went to a bad movie and you got bad popcorn in your room united, right? I mean any serious suffering that is avoidable and it's not avoided is a form of violence. So injustice and domination and oppression and gross inequality are forms of violence. They kill people. They murder people. And I'd rather be shot in the head than starve to death. How about you? So, I mean, that's what I mean. And I think capitalism does that as a system, again, as a structure. Not that there aren't some people whose lives are, great because of capitalism. Of course that's true. It's not that some people's lives aren't made a bit better by capitalism. Of course that's true. There are marginal gains and so on, of course. But as a system or as a structure, I believe that capitalism is a form of violence. And by the way, I just think it's another mistake to talk about, I direct a peace and justice studies program, but there's a problem about differentiating peace and justice, and on one hand, and violence and injustice on the other. I think we have to do better work at seeing injustice as a form of violence, and peace as a form of, we do better seeing peace as a form of nonviolence, but especially injustice as a form of violence.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned the concept of desert, of people deserving things.
Yeah.
That implies that either we or some teleological truth system or some God of some kind would then place a judgment. That there's a judgment that can be placed about what people deserve and what they don't deserve.
Right.
How does that relate to your views on violence?
Okay. You've raised a very good, problem.
It's a big question.
It's a great question, because here's an interesting thing. All human beings, as far as I know, use language of desert. We all quite comfortably say things like, he really got it come. He deserved that. Or, she didn't deserve that. We're all very comfortable with that language. We actually think we know what people deserve and what they don't deserve, especially ourselves. We're all very damn certain of what we deserve, right? But I don't think there's any basis at all for making those judgments. I think it's a very strange thing about human beings that we all talk so comfortably about who deserves what. And there's no reason at all to make those judgments. We have no basis to make them except entirely arbitrary, socially constructed reasons that we just come up with. So I don't like language of desert. I hate it when, you hear people talk like that, especially when they're legislators and so on. When their ideas of what people deserve really impacts our lives. That worries me, to say the very least.
With your position clarified, maybe I can ask a more specific question. So you make the claim that killing and perhaps permanent injury to anyone is wrong, at least, if we narrow it down. But is that because they don't deserve it, or is that for some other reason?
I'm not sure if I understood the question. I said what?
You make the claim that killing people or that permanent injury of some kind is wrong, that violence is wrong. But is that because these people don't deserve it, because no one deserves it, because we're human beings? Or is that for some other reason? Because otherwise, I don't know. That gets messy to me. That seems like we might have some inconsistency.
Yeah, I just avoid language of desert, so I wouldn't say no one deserves it.
Okay. So
I'd be more inclined to say the scary thing is, we all deserve it. So I tried to say that earlier. I'm quite willing to say, it seems obvious to me, it seems entirely non-controversial to say, we'd be a lot better off if that person were not around. I mean, I hope I don't sound mean, but I could create a pretty long list of people who, if they were not among us, we'd all be better off. I wouldn't mind reading in the paper today that so-and-so passed away in his sleep, I'd go, that's kind of a good thing. It wouldn't bother me.
But to start talking about, well, what that person deserves, that's a whole other thing. And I, you know, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line between who deserves what and why? And it becomes, to me, it becomes utterly arbitrary. We try not to make it arbitrary. We come up with rules, and we come up with principles, and we come up with, you know, agreements. And I think all those rules and principles and agreements are a kind of facade. And they're a facade that papers over the utter arbitrariness of doing that.
You mentioned that nonviolence works as itself in movements and struggles and these sorts of things. Do you think the position just becomes untenable if you're not actually engaged in those activities? I mean, essentially it's, okay, well, this is a lifestyle choice for me, I'm choosing nonviolence, so you X, Y, and Z. As opposed to actually trying to struggle to change institutions, you know, that this person's capitalism or policy system of violence.
Well, that's a difficult question for me, if I understood your question correctly, because on one hand, I think everybody should be up to their eyeballs, like many of you are, and like I have been, you know, in much of my life, and maybe still am, just trying to make the world better in all kinds of ways, on all kinds of fronts, in structural, systematic, deep, meaningful, institutional ways. You know, and on one level, I just want to say everybody needs to be doing that as much as they can. And if you're not, you're a poser. You're a liar. You know, you're on the wrong side. On the other hand, you know, for God's sake, you know, we all need to just enjoy life a bit. And you know, there are people who just make beautiful music and that's all they do, and I'm glad they do that. You know, I'm glad that their music enriches my world, and they're not, you know, they're not on the front lines of anything. They're just making music or good food or whatever. And I think, you know, or they you know, and I think there's something to that too. So I think there's an actual kind of dilemma and dialectic and a kind of searching for the right kind of balance that we all need to do. And at one level, we need to be up to here in it, and in another way we don't. And I think people who claim to be pacifists, I believe, have an extra obligation, as it were, a kind of extra duty to be up to here in trying to change the world nonviolently. Because there's one thing about violence, there's no symmetry between violence and nonviolence. There's no, you know, it takes thousands and thousands and thousands of people acting courageously in concert with one another to do the good that would offset the horrendous evil one person could do violently if, you know, he has access to the levers of power that he can set in motion certain events. I mean, there's a kind of power to violence in its destructiveness that takes a few, whereas there's a necessity for the power of nonviolence to be made manifest and institutionalized by the many. And so there's a kind of built-in profound advantage to those who would use violence. And so I think that when people employ violence, usually, this is very easy to see in the case of the United States, you know, when we send troops off to Iraq or Afghanistan or Grenada or Honduras or, you know, you name it, that's the easy thing to do. There's nothing courageous about that. There's nothing costly about that. That's just the easiest thing to do. We can be slackers and be lazy and be stupid and be selfish and, you know, year after year, decade after decade, and then send the troops somewhere, you know. Whereas if you don't believe in sending the troops somewhere, you have to relentlessly work all the time to bring about the good you want to bring about. Because you don't have, as a tool in the toolkit, sending the troops somewhere. Josh, and then
Yeah, like the kind of main thing I would like to talk about is, so I mean, we're talking about violence, and it seems like we're talking about it in a strictly hypothetical sense, because I mean, we live in the United States, and I can't really think of any progressive, activist groups in the United States that are actually using violence. At this point, we're basically all of us are in the nonviolent stage. But there is violence happening in the world today, and there's progressive violence happening in the world today, and it's usually in the third world countries where they are resisting the violence of the United States. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, or people who are fighting against death squads and things like that. The U.S. has set up as puppet governments and things like that. So it just kind of seems to me like a little bit hypocritical to universally reject violence while living in a country which is reaping the benefits of this horrendous, massive violence that is occurring worldwide. So I wonder what, well actually I can read a quote from Franz Fanon that I'd just like to hear what your response to this would be. Oh, it's actually by Jean-Paul Sartre. He says, the pacifists are a fine sight, neither victims nor torturers. Come now, if you are not a victim when the government you voted for in the army your young brothers served in commits genocide without hesitation or remorse, then you are undoubtedly a torturer. And if you choose to be a victim, risking 1 or 2 days in prison, you are simply trying to take the easy way out. But you can't. There is no way out. Get this into your head. If violence were only a thing of the future, if exploitation and oppression never existed on Earth, perhaps displays of nonviolence might relieve the conflict. But if the entire regime, even your nonviolent thoughts, is governed by a 1,000-year-old oppression, your passiveness serves no other purpose but to put you on the side of the oppressors. So basically, my question is how should pacifists living in the United States deal with either with support or non-support of the violent resistance to American imperialism?
Okay. Well, that quote is a great one, and it raises a lot of issues, but I'll try to be very quick. I do agree that I have a problem of complicity, and I submit everyone in this room has the same problem. For example, I'm not the only one living in the United States. So, should we pay taxes? There are good reasons not to pay taxes. Should we live in the United States? There are good reasons not to live in the United States, whether we're pacifists or not. I think the idea that a pacifist has some obligation to, not live in the United States or fight American imperialism or some way that the non-pacifist doesn't have, that strikes me as odd. And if you, by the way, since you used the word hypocritical, let me counterpose this question. I don't believe that people ought to kill other people, and therefore I'm not killing other people. Some of you believe we should kill other people. So the question to you is, why aren't you doing it?
Why
That seems more hypocritical to me.
Well, because I'm not saying that it's necessarily efficacious right now for us to engage in violence. My question is specifically with regard to, do we also reject the violence of people defending themselves from U.S. imperialists while we ourselves are living in the United States and benefiting?
Yeah, and my answer to that is, we are all more, everyone in this room, I believe, is, our lives are problematized by living in the United States. And I think there are reasons to do it, and I think there are reasons not to do it. There are compelling arguments about leaving, and there are compelling arguments to staying. And in short, I think if a person thinks that by living here, they may affect some change here that would justify their being here, then I'm okay with that. And for example, I see myself that way. If someone just lives here and reaps the benefits of living here, but does not in any way or any significant way try to address the evils of American imperialism, then I think that person is morally suspect and has a problem they need to face up to. So, I mean, that's what I think.
Sure, but I'm curious as to what you actually think of the people who are actually engaged in violence.
Well, the people who are engaged in violence there are people all over the world, in the United States and outside the United States, who are engaged in violence in two respects. One is, it seems to them the very best moral option they have. And two, they are in such circumstances that they, I don't think it's reasonable to expect that they would act differently, or at least you could understand quite deeply and sympathetically why they are engaged in the violence in which they're engaged. So they deserve from me a kind of sympathetic understanding and a kind of solidarity. Not the solidarity of their violence, not that I think the right thing to do is join them in their violence, but I can join them in their cause in nonviolent ways. So they deserve solidarity from me. This should be the last, because my ride home has been walking out there wondering when I'm going to leave. So, anyway.
Should probably do it.
That's okay. That was basically mostly, there's a little bit more, but that's basically my question. So.
I have a question if nobody's bold
Okay.
enough to take the last one.
Okay.
It seems to me like there's this sort of tentative distance or something like that to these secular reasonings around nonviolence. I'm wondering if that centrals around the idea that, or that sort of distancing comes around from the idea of radical transformation of humanity, and that's why you believe it's more efficacious to believe in on theological grounds that nonviolence is something that we can definitely achieve and should achieve. You understand my question?
Yeah, by the way, I don't believe that all teleologies have the same efficacy or the same value. And so I think some teleologies are quite harmful and non-efficacious. You could be a Buddhist, for example, who just thinks, well, Buddhism is a good way to talk about teleology. But you could think something like, well, the world's just going to end up the way it's going to end up, because that's the way it's going to end up, and there's nothing that anybody can do about it, so screw it, right? And you'd have a kind of teleology, but it wouldn't help anybody. But if you think that there is something like the great in the universe, to go back to that metaphor, and you are working with it, and you are kind of pushing, and Marx thought this, for example, right, that you're kind of pushing things along the way that they're going to go. Martin Luther King thought this. That things are going that way.
Second part's right.
That's the way they're going to go, and I'm helping them along. There's something that's inevitable about this, and not that we aren't crucial aspects of it, but we're on the winning side of history here. That's the way it's going to end up. So I might as well be on the winning side, right? All Marxists think that. Well, of course, right? Just
No, not even a little bit. Good
a
Marxists.
lot, right?
Good Marxists don't. Vulgar Marxists do.
Okay.
Sorry, Mike.
I wasn't very clear with my
I'm
question.
not saying there's some I'm not saying there's some transcendent inevitability.
Well, just real quick, Communist Manifesto, all history is a history of class struggle hitherto. But here's the important thing. Either the revolutionary class has won, or there's been mutual ruination of them both.
No, I know. I've read the manifesto. But, go ahead.
I was just saying, I wasn't terribly clear with my question. Basically, it boils down to this. My perception is that you think that nonviolence inevitably will work, but the underpinnings for that is basically some theological underpinning of radical transformation of humanity.
Not humanity as such, but human beings.
Okay. So, I mean, like...
No, so yes, you might have, for example, a Christian view that human beings can be radically transformed, and that would play into or be a factor of, you know, or part of one's idea that things can be better, things can change.
Would you say then that that's the big difference between the sort of secular material versus the theological transformative?
Well, I don't know if that's the big difference. I think maybe the big difference is if you're a secularist, then ultimately you have nothing to rely on but yourself, you know, but us. I don't mean oneself individually, but all we have is us. You know, we're going to make it happen or we're not. And that has, you know, that doesn't seem like a very that's a pretty, as Kant said, weak reed upon which to lean, frankly. But if you're if you have a theological eschatology and teleology and theology of certain kinds, then, you know, the future isn't in our hands. And thank God, right, literally, that it isn't. Right? And I think that's the fundamental difference. I think that's the fundamental difference. Okay. All I was trying to say earlier is, and I think Marxists, again, are like this, we want to be on the winning side. Who wants to be on the losing side? Raise your hand.
If the losing side is socialism.
But we all want socialism to win, and we want to be on that side.
Right, but I mean, this is a distinction. I think good Marxists recognize capitalism can win. And given how the last 50 years have gone, it's winning. And if it wins, we all die. Like, I mean, vulgar Marxists...
I didn't mean to say that Marx thought socialism can't fail. I didn't mean to say that.
I mean, you want socialism to win.
Well, he clearly wrote as though it will. He thinks it will. He didn't say it's inevitable that it will. It can't not lose. He never wrote that. But he clearly wrote that he thinks it's going to prevail.
It's just different.
Okay. Thanks for having me.